So let's review the schemes and tropes quiz together. I want us to just say a couple things about the definitions at the top here. I think a lot of people were confused about the difference between apposition and parenthesis. So let me talk about that just for a second. The key to remembering the difference between apposition and parenthesis is this insertion of the verbal unit, the verb. For apposition, think a positive phrase, right? You know what an appositive phrase is. It kind of interrupts, but in an explanatory kind of way. So an appositive phrase creates apposition, and it's just an explanatory element, and not really a complete thought. A parenthesis or a parenthetical interruption is something that's much more of an interrupter, interrupts the normal flow of the sentence. So if you're trying to figure out the difference in a phrase, whether it's parenthesis or apposition, look for a verb. If it has a verb, then it's probably a more complete thought, and that means that it's parenthesis and not apposition. Generally, parenthesis functions as an interrupter, as a way for the writer to insert her own ideas or opinions into the middle of whatever she's writing about. And I think you'll see it kind of most often used that way. So those seem to give people just a little bit of trouble. The other words you just need to learn, I think. If you have any questions about those, please post them on the discussion thread on Haiku, and I'll be happy to answer. Just be clear about what question you're asking me about. So let's talk for a second about the speech. Synecdoche, remember, a part for a whole. I was really going for ears here. So obviously people aren't lending literally their ears, but rather they are paying attention or listening. Many people here, or several other people, wanted to call this synecdoche, and it technically is, right? When he says put a tongue in every wound of Caesar, he literally means that he is expressing the grief and the frustration and the horror of every wound in Caesar and letting the wounds speak for Caesar, right? And so technically you could argue that that's a kind of synecdoche or metonymy as well. The irony, the biggest irony, of course, in this speech is that he keeps repeating that Brutus is honorable. And, of course, he is suggesting in the speech that Brutus is not, in fact, honorable, but to blame. And then our example of apostrophe is when he speaks, "O judgment, to judgment, thou judgment, art fled to brutish beasts." Again, if you have any questions, let me know. The metonymy in number 14 is in the cradle and the grave, as a way of expressing a lifetime, right? These two things are associated with birth and then with death. And metonymy is an association like that. If you wanted to argue that the sunbeam was being substituted for happiness, then you could probably argue that that was metonymy. But not just sunbeam as a piece of the sun, right? Because a sunbeam is a thing, a full thing in and of itself. And so that is not by itself metonymy or even synecdoche. You could call it metonymy if you wanted to argue that a sunbeam is happiness, but I don't think that was the case for those of you who chose sunbeam here. And the better answer is the cradle and the grave. Number 15 tricked a lot of you because of the negative. Just because you have a negative doesn't mean that something is litotes, right? For it to be litotes, you have to be negating the opposite of what you mean. And roofs is not, we don't mean, he doesn't mean the floor, and so the roof is the opposite of the floor or something like that. What he's asking there is, in fact, are there no homes, or are there no people who live in homes who will harbor me? And so we could call this synecdoche because it was a roof is a part of a house. You could argue that it's metonymy if you wanted to say that the house is associated with the home and the family that would in fact harbor an honorable man. Of course, this is also a kind of rhetorical question in and of itself, but I think the better answer, the stronger answer, was in fact synecdoche. Number 16 is an example of an allusion, right, to Neptune. It is also an example of hyperbole. Clearly, remember this is from Macbeth, clearly we don't have this much Macbeth doesn't have this much blood on his hands. And so certainly it's hyperbole. And then if you wanted to argue that blood is being associated with guilt, then I think you could even call that metonymy if you wanted to. Number 17 I mentioned in class, but a lot of people wanted to put parallelism or parallel structure, and that is not incorrect. But what we also have working here is an antithesis, right? It is parallel in construction, but opposite, less, and then more in content. We also can call this a kind of paradox because antithesis often creates a kind of paradox. Number 18 is specifically an oxymoron. While it is not incorrect to call this a paradox, it is most correct to call it an oxymoron. And finally, the big E at the end of the quiz, right, are two comic strips. This first, Frank and Ernest, I think would best be called punning. So what they're doing is they're playing around with the meanings of these words, right? The way we use the word expecting, and the way we use draft, the word draft, and its multiple meanings, right? And drinking and driving, and its multiple meanings. So that is best called punning, playing around with the multiple meanings of words. And then finally, I think this is probably best identified as euphemism, right? So when he's saying that, you might call him croaky, and the fly isn't lady, it's passed on, and he has gone to a better place, and he doesn't understand what that means, and so finally we just have to come out and say he's dead, right? It's dead, 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 the fly is. There's a kind of euphemism in trying to be less harsh, which would be the rhetorical purpose of euphemism. So there you go. There's a review of the quiz. If you have questions about anything that I didn't discuss or need a more specific explanation about something that you missed, please post to the discussion. Make sure that you review all of this in preparation for the in-class quiz that's on the books for next week. And think about all of these things when you're doing your take-home quiz for On Compassion.